Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I know this is not our regular hour, and for some of you out there on the West Coast, and certainly in Hawaii, it's especially early, but we're fighting the tyranny of distance and really time zones here. So for a very special event, so we can bring in some true experts in the field on cyber in China, from China. But first, let me welcome everyone. For those of you joining us for the first time, I am Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. This is the next in our quarterly webinars supporting ACC and trying to help the Department of the Air Force and the DoD better understand China. Today's event will focus on the cyber dimension related to China, and we've assembled a truly expert panel with some really deep experience, so this should be terrific. So on behalf of CASI and our ACC partners, I'd like to welcome you all and good morning. So first, the standard disclaimer for everyone, including me, that this is speaking today, that we're all speaking in our own personal capacity and not necessarily representing the views of the U.S. government, their employers, or anyone else for that matter. So we are recording this session for those who are unable to make it, and it'll be made available on the CASI website and on Divids in the future. So with that, let me introduce our panel. Leading off today will be Naomi Wilson. She is currently the Vice President of Policy for Asia at the Information Technology and Industry Council. This is the premier global advocate for technology, and they promote public policies and industry standards that advance competition and innovation worldwide. In addition to Mandarin, she also speaks French, so hats off to her. I find one language plenty enough for my repertoire. Next, joining us, we'll have my longtime friend, Professor Shun Yi. Dr. Shun is the Associate Professor for the Department of the International Politics at the School of International Relations. He is the Standing Director for the Lab on National Cybersecurity, Strategy and Technology. He is the Deputy Director for the Center of BRICS, that's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America Studies, so BRICS Studies. All of that at Fudan University, which is where we were classmates a decade and a half ago. It doesn't seem like it was that long, but it has been. And it's already 2100, 9 o'clock p.m. in Shanghai, hence the early start for us here. So we really appreciate him staying up late and taking some of his personal time to join us today. And then we have Jonathan Hillman. He is the Senior Fellow for the CSIS Economics Program and the Director of the Reconnecting Asia Project, which is one of the most extensive open source databases on the Belt and Road Initiative for China. He has a new book out. It's called The Digital Silk Road, China's Quest to Wire the World and Win the Future by HarperCollins, which is available for purchase. And so with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Naomi Wilson, and we will kick it off. All right, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Brendan. It's great to be with you all this morning and evening, respectively, wherever you happen to be in the world. So I'm Naomi Wilson. As Brendan mentioned, I currently work for a technology trade association, ITI, which is based in Washington, D.C. And I previously was at the Department of Homeland Security, working on China cyber issues, in addition to all things Asia, covering the array of issues that the department covers. So what I thought I would do this morning is speak a little bit from my perspective at DHS, in particular around the time of the 2015 US-China cyber accord between Presidents Obama and Xi, which I worked on, and then kind of my perspective now from the private sector, because I think certain things have changed, and there are persistent narratives within the China sphere that are sometimes difficult to either debunk or to modify with the appropriate nuance that the time makes necessary. So I will start by saying, the methods and tactics have changed with China over the past even several years, and it's long been an evolution, both bureaucratically as well as from a private sector perspective, And I think it's important to keep in mind that, while the Chinese government is extremely top down, it is still not a monolith. And it still does take a certain degree of knocking heads to get the interagency in China to play well together. And in particular, the cyber policy side and the security side, and in this case, the Ministry of Public Security, as well as the intelligence components. So going back to 2015, just as a sort of scene setter, this was at a time when the US was really kind of fed up with China's behavior. The US government had made clear on several occasions, and the core issue here was really IP theft for economic gain through cyber means. And that's a very important phrase because it's what we ultimately were able to get the Chinese government to agree that neither government would support nor endorse or turn a blind eye to. So that was the first time that the Chinese really had made the distinction even between economic espionage and traditional espionage. And of course, now we find ourselves in a different situation with the most recent national security strategy, effectively linking those two on the US side. But even though that the US policy has changed, what we found was that China did meet the letter of the commitment that they had signed up for. And I think, it's important to put this in context of there are a few reasons that we got to this agreement that, we had pushed so long for China to really acknowledge that economic espionage through cyber means was out of bounds. And for the longest time, they had pushed back and said, just do a better job of protecting your systems and everything will be fine. So we had the context of a state visit between President Xi and President Obama at the time, which was really important for President Xi at the time. It was important for him to be able to showcase on an international stage that basically China and the US were on a level playing field, on even footing. And the Chinese government and the staff below President Xi in particular wanted nothing to go wrong with this state visit. And so when the US government started to contemplate taking action based on China's persistent use of cyber espionage for economic means, the Chinese got really rattled. And they came to DC on effectively less than 48 hours notice and brokered this deal with us on the eve of that visit. So this, in part, it was a political imperative for them, but also I think the timing was right for them. So China changes slowly over time, but they don't do anything that's not in their interest and that they're not ready to do. And at this point in time, I think they had heard sufficiently from the international community that the persistent cyber theft was just not working for them anymore. There was a reputational cost associated with it that made this the right time to make that deal. And ultimately, they went on to make the same deal with other governments. The other piece of this is that China didn't really need to steal anymore. It's a mistake to say that China just steals everything. They are now truly competitive and innovative in their own right. And so the need had lessened. And that's where we get into, this narrative of, does China still persistently steal IP? Yes and no. They do sometimes, but it's through different means. And as I mentioned, they followed the letter of the agreement following the conclusion of that commitment. And that's one thing that when I was at DHS, we consistently checked with the private sector side, because they're the ones that have the visibility into their own systems, to verify that indeed the intrusions were going down. And we knew that there had been some internal machinations to kind of bring order to certain parts of the Ministry of State Security in particular, as well as the Ministry of Public Security. So all that means that we succeeded in having China follow the letter of the agreement and the spirit of the agreement, but China still has certain other tactics that they use. And in terms of IP, what we see on the private sector is the imposition of security review regimes and forced partnerships that kind of allow an inside look into primarily the business operations of a foreign company or a US company. And that's important to distinguish, because I think when people think of security review regimes and joint partnerships, they automatically think of this is another opportunity to just steal technology. And what the shift in tactics has meant is less stealing technology, more co-opting and taking credit for business practices. And so what I mean by this is, for example, in the cloud sector, American companies are far and away the leaders, both in the technology, but also in the business model. And in China, the requirement is that only your Chinese partner can obtain a license to operate in China for you. And they basically operate under your brand name or under their brand name, running your operations. So it's effectively both like a masterclass in how to run a successful international cloud services operation, and also enables the Chinese partner to really take credit for all of the work that the foreign company has done to date to get themselves into that position. So, it's important to make that distinction and to understand exactly what they are gaining in that relationship, and that it's not a completely, even besides that, it's not a completely lopsided relationship. There is still learning going on both sides, and it is joint partnerships. Joint ventures in particular are important mechanisms to access any foreign market for companies. The other area that I'd like to point out as we look at the threat landscape is how to distinguish between true national security threats and what I call long shadows. If everything is a threat, then nothing is. So at this point in time, there's a confluence of events across both the technology sector and with COVID, and certain Chinese actions in the international arena, including human rights, that have really degraded not only the bilateral relationship, but also how everyday Americans perceive China. And it's important not to let that cloud the bigger picture. There needs to be, in my opinion, a more strategic and focused perspective on China and on risk management in particular. To say that everything China is bad or a threat is really not productive when US government resources are limited, and they will always be limited. China's not going away. It's a fact of life for both the international community and the business community. And there is a symbiotic relationship there. So there needs to be a recognition that balance is important, that China is an important economic driver globally, an important piece of the supply chain, and they're an important competitor from a positive perspective in that they help drive competition and innovation. And some of the areas that I've seen this narrative of just China equals bad, equals US government needs to do something, include international technical standards, which has become kind of an unfortunate narrative. A lot of policy pieces, and we hear the same repetition of talking points from policymakers that China's taking over in international standards. They're setting the standards for the future technology. But that's not an accurate representation of what's going on. And it's really important that these assertions without assessment aren't taken as fact. And because ultimately that will only eat up US resources. And the way I like to think of this is you need to ask yourself the so what question. China is sending more participants in international standards, for example. So what? What threat does that pose? And there have been instances, for example, where China has kind of fumbled around in the international system, and they try to use their own tactics, which are a lot more top down, and it does come off as government direction of the private sector. But even when those instances have been allowed to play out within international fora, ultimately the protocols in place and the participants have prevented any undue influence. So when I hear these comments that, well, China's trying to push their own proposal on XYZ, the question again is, so what? What happened? Ultimately, it failed on its merits, as it should. The system worked, and there's no need to marshal any additional US resources on the government side to prevent that. Where China fails, let them fail on their own. The other point that I would make is the focus does really need to be on running faster and not trying to simply trip up our competition. As I mentioned, that competition and innovation does not exist in a vacuum. And we need to be comfortable with China playing more of a role internationally in joining international agreements, and really take that as an opportunity to enable other countries, in addition to the US, to hold them accountable and to hold them to those higher standards. But to think that we can completely disaggregate, both in the form of international government agreements, as well as from a supply chain perspective, I think is very short-sighted. A lot of policymakers still ask the question, why can't companies just get out of China? It's just not worth it. And the bottom line is that companies cannot be competitive globally if they're not in China. And this is where the US perspective can be a bit myopic, because the thought is, well, if we just force US companies to come home or to leave, then all will be well. But you have to remember, it's a competitive market. Other companies are not, beholden to their governments. Where US companies exit, other international companies are waiting in the wings. And that effectively closes out US companies from the supply chain, from options to compete not only in China, but also internationally. A couple of suggestions and recommendations from my time in government, and both working with the private sector and government, as well as working with the government on the private sector side. I think there's still a lack of trust between the U.S. private sector and the government. There needs to be more of an open discourse and less of the fear of reprisal on the company side. And I think some of that did come from the previous administration, in the sense that companies don't want to be named and shamed for trying to do business in China. And you're not going to get full access to information and cooperation with US companies if they feel like they are on the cusp or have the potential to be named and shamed. And that private sector relationship is really important. As I saw when I was in government, it's still a bit of an unknown, even within government itself, that the US government is not typically on private sector networks. And so the reliance on the private sector is imperative. I saw this from the IC perspective, where it can be very difficult even for the best intelligence community to make determinations about what China is or isn't doing without the active participation of the private sector. And so those linkages really would be beneficial, I think, to improve in the long run, not only in the form of information sharing, but also, potentially rotations between government and the private sector, to really get that mix of expertise and perspective on both sides. So in a nutshell, I think, the key takeaway here is that not all things China are bad, even in the cyber realm. And, we need to look at China and Chinese policy as a continuum, and something that does change over time. It's not stagnant, and we need to change our narrative, and we also need to change our allocation of resources in order to meet the challenge and address national security threats where they truly exist. But in other areas that are more aspirational for the Chinese government, we need to let them run out their resources and preserve ours. So I will stop there, and thank you for having me this morning.
Well, I think that was just terrific. A great way to start us off, and I like the fact that you do what we try to do here at CASI, is to present things as they are, right? So there's good parts and there's bad parts, and we both need to understand all of that. So I think that was really great. Thank you for that, and I appreciate you taking some time this morning. I should have mentioned at the start, we're also on live streaming to YouTube and Facebook. I know we have people joining us there. So not only can you use the Q&A function, as people are already starting to do here on Zoom, but if you are joining us on YouTube or Facebook because you couldn't get into the Zoom, please go ahead and put your comments in the questions, the questions in the comment section, and we will get to those as we go along. And so with that, we will turn to Professor Shun. He is logged on and ready to go. So again, a longtime friend. We first met each other in 2003 when my wife and I moved to Shanghai and started studying at Fudan University. So on behalf of CASI and the ACC webinar, Professor Shen, if you are ready to go. 我们要欢迎你来我们今天的小讨论会，我们很荣幸你要参加我们的小会。
Thank you, Brandy. You are my best friend in the United States. It's a long time no see, and it's my great pleasure. Also, a little bit surprising here to participate in these online discussions on cyber issues. I'd like to make several points. First, when talking about the Sino-US relationships, I just noticed that the question already raised, say that talking about what China's cyber can do in the cyberspace. Maybe that's the first point we need to be clear. What a nation state, a state actor can do and cannot do in the cyberspace. I remember when go back to year 2015, when we're talking about these OPM attack issues, Mr. Klaber, the Director Office of National Intelligence Office Director, Mr. Klaber, make a testimony in the Congress hearing, said that the OPM attack is not a cyber attack. It's a classic passive information or intelligence collective actions in the cyberspace, just as we do. It's quite clear all nation states has their necessary requirement to gather intelligence and informations by all means. And in digital age, it means that the state actors need to collect data, informations, intelligence in the cyberspace via digital means. So the question is not whether the nation state has the right to do so, but how to make a kind of norms or code of conduct to regulate such kind of actions so that these actions can be controlled under certain levels so that it will not do damage to the general relationships between these state actors. While on the other side, when you visit the Cyber Command website of the United States, it's quite clear that it's a slogan saying the main task for Cyber Command is to expand the freedom of the United States and its allies in the cyberspace, and they try to narrow the same freedom for its advisories. It means that we have the competition among different state actors, especially those two actors who believe they have some conflict of interest. They will launch these competitions whether to expand the one side freedoms and narrow the other side space of freedom of actions in the cyberspace. So we need to build a narrative and environment and atmosphere that we can talk these questions based on common sense. The common sense is the United States and China and other great powers has their obligations and requirements to get information and the intelligence from the cyberspace. And these state actors need to build the norms to regulate their behaviors so that it can lead to a strategic stabilities in the cyberspace. And the third, of course, not the least, maybe during these actions, if these countries did not want to conflict with each other, it should respect each other's core interest. They will not leading to do damages to the core interest of each other so that they can continue their actions just what they did in the normal world, which means outside the cyberspace. And the second, what's China's main interest and the goals in the global cyberspace issues, especially talking about Sino-US relationships? Also go back to the year 2015. At that time, when we still have the possibilities to dialogue in a normal way between our two sides. It's quite clear from China's side, at least our top leaders sending out a very between our two great powers, it should not become a kind of source of conflict between our two sides. At that time, I happened the opportunities to working with the CAC to providing some policy analysis. And it's quite clear from China's side, we wish to dialogue with the United States to talking about whether we have building a common consensus on how to regulate our behaviors in the cyberspace. But a little bit of regret is from then on, it's quite clear the United States has a kind of intention to set up a symmetric norms of behaviors in cyberspace, which will regulate China unilaterally, which means the United States providing China, the United States push China's side to accept a kind of concept, any kind of information collections in the cyberspace will be definite as a kind of nation state-sponsored behavior or the espionage actions in the cyberspace, which should be eliminated or should be forbidden. Any such kind of actions should not be considered as a normal action of national intelligence actions, but a kind of cybercrime, and it should be stopped from China's side. If China accepts these norms, it means the China side will automatically give up the right to collect information and intelligence in the cyberspace. It's quite clear we have some conflict because from China's side, when we believe we already limit those so-called cybercrime and espionage from our side, the United States were providing us more evidence, especially those intelligence collection evidence. And based on that evidence, the US believed China did not keep its promise, which will do damage to the Sino-US trust. It lead a lot of problems and confusions. And finally, of course, when this new government in 2017 keep the White House office, all the communication channels has been stopped and shut down, especially on these cyber-related issues. A little bit of regret from China's side. In the past several years, we did not get much enough progress on these cyber issues. But from China's side, now I think the central government set 3 or 4 very clear points on understanding of how to set up our national goals on the cyber-related issues. The first is so-called cyber sovereignties, which means unilaterally Chinese government should have a very complete sovereignty rights to regulate all those related issues inside China's borders. While on the other side, it means in international or in global cyberspace governance, China's as a state actors should have the equal rights with the other state actors to jointly participate these norm setting or policy making procedures globally when these issues or norms related to cyberspace issues, the first. And the second, the Chinese government believe the digital economy is very important. And the infrastructure is also very important to push forward the development of these digital economies. But domestically, the Chinese government will regulate the direction of the development of digital economy, in which we believe that these digital economies should target toward the modernization of industries rather than focusing too much on finance and consumer side of these economies. And also the Chinese government will try to building a more free competition market orders domestically rather than allow very few huge platforms monopoly the huge digital economies, which will leading to a great gap between the rich and the poor. And the third is about the cross-border data fellows, how to regulate these things. Regulate the cross-border data fellows is very important and become one of the most important central parts of our national security strategies. It's quite clear from China's side that we need to keep a balance, because on one hand, we believe we understand that these free cross-border data flows is a necessary requirement for normal business procedures in the e-commerce and in the age of digital times. On the other hand, we also believe that the state actors need to regulate this data properly so that we can set up a kind of so-called orderly cross-border data flows. It's not a free flows. It's not only allowed data localizations, but we permit the legalized data flows when they're doing the business. They need to obey such kind of procedures, which means before they're doing the business, before they transfer the data, they need to get the permissions from the central government, and then they can transfer those data, obey that regulations. And of course, we need at the same time completion and the pursuit soldering those. That's the digital age. We always lost the connection to come back. And the Chinese government want to regulate this data, cross-border data flows. It will try to make much more improvement of these regulation systems and set up lots of laws. Before the launch of these laws, they try to collect information from all sides so that these laws can keep this balance as much as possible. Last, of course, the least, in the more general ways, talking about this governance issues, the Chinese government making its understanding of the fourth point from central government's understanding that the cyberspace, or especially the social media based on the cyberspace, is very important for the improvement of our government's capacities. Well, the government need to improve its capacities to regulate these social medias, especially improve its capacities to regulate the so-called disinformation, the misinformations, and those information may be a little bit unwelcomed by some people inside government properly. I need to better build a kind of more balanced systems to regulate all these informations. But in general ways, especially after last year's fighting against the pandemic, in the nationwide, the central government got more supporters from normal peoples, especially the young generations. We named the Z generations. And these generation peoples, they have very strong capacities to use the cyberspace to press their ideas, understanding, thoughts, attitude on all the things inside the Chinese and outside the world. And these people are extremely active, not only in China's social media space, but also in the global social media space. I think in futures, maybe these generations will providing us more interesting and bright futures, or maybe providing some chemicals changes on these relationship issues. And then the big 3 points, what on the future, I think in these Biden administrations, especially talking about the well-going the summit for democracies. Inside China, we feel a little bit concerned whether this summit or in future the Biden administrations will build a. And we concerned that maybe the democracy or other those value things will be attached to technical standards, and then leading to these governance issues and discussion more complicated. It may be finally leading to mission impossible to get general consensus for talking about these norms of governance issues in a general ways. It will be a tragedy for both sides. And we should push forward the discussions in a more general ways and which obey the natural rules of the development of ICT technologies, which will do benefit for both sides. Okay, I think I finished here, and then in future, if I have the question and answers, I will input my ideas. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that. I have a ton of notes and questions that we'll get, and I'm sure there's going to be more in the Q&A session. So that was fantastic. Thank you for that, and for fighting through all the technology issues Zoom obviously has come a long way, especially for during COVID times, but we still have some things to work out. So with that, we will next turn to Jonathan Hillman, and he's going to pick it up and take it away.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm going to share my screen here if I can do that. Okay, is that coming through?
Yep, it is indeed. We can see it.
Okay, thanks. So what I'd like to do relatively briefly here, because I'm pretty interested to hear people's comments and questions. I'd like to give sort of a really kind of crash course overview of some of the topics I cover in this new book, The Digital Silk Road. And this is basically a book about the digital or technology dimension of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I've spent the last 5 years studying at CSIS. And we have a project called the Reconnecting Asia Project with a lot of resources explaining, what the Belt and Road is and isn't, and looking at it in different parts of the world. So I'll just briefly talk about some of the drivers and why I think this set of digital infrastructure activities that China is pursuing beyond its borders is actually intensifying and becoming more consequential in the aftermath of the pandemic. And then I want to highlight a few areas that I think are important. I cover more areas in the book. I also talk a little bit about wireless networks and also a little bit about safe cities. But just for brevity today, I'm going to try to touch these 3 areas: subsea cables, cloud services, and then a subset of satellites. So I do think, as someone who's spent a significant amount of time looking at China's Belt and Road Initiative, which, as many of you know, is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision announced in 2013. And, the first phase of Belt and Road was really primarily focused on transport and energy projects. Those were the 2 most active sectors. But I think digital infrastructure in many ways is better suited to the international environment that we find ourselves in today. And so I think there's a set of factors that it's both pushing those projects out of China and pulling them into other countries. And so let me just unpack those really quickly here. One really practical advantage of digital projects, although it depends on what we're talking about, is that these digital projects often cost less than large transport and energy projects. And so, we're living in a world in which many developing countries are under debt distress. About 100 countries last year were going to the IMF to talk about debt relief. For most of those countries, China is their largest bilateral official creditor. And so there's an appeal here of doing projects with a lower price tag, just because a lot of developing countries don't have the fiscal space to borrow and do those larger transport and energy projects. Digital projects are also typically faster to deliver when you just look at the time it takes to announce them and then complete them. And this is one example. In the picture here, we're looking at workers who are laying the first fiber optic cable, direct fiber optic connection between China and Pakistan. And so this is on the Pakistani side of the border. They're at high altitude here. And it's, this looks like basically a couple of workers. It sort of looks like a road service crew. And I think that speaks to, again, some of the practical advantages of doing these digital projects. You don't need hundreds of workers. You don't need to relocate people. The immediate impacts on the environment are often less visible, less noticeable. So all of that, I think, is advantageous. And then there's a set of sort of geopolitical factors here that I think are also important and are helping drive some of this activity. As Chinese tech companies encounter more scrutiny in advanced economies like the United States, countries in Western Europe, Australia, Japan, in order to continue to grow, they are doubling down in markets where arguments about security risks might not be the decisive factor, and considerations about cost and upfront affordability might be more important. And so I think that's also helping intensify this set of activities. And finally, the pandemic has clearly underscored that you don't want to be on the losing side of the digital divide. There's a vast unmet need for digital infrastructure globally. Literally about half of humanity still lacks a reliable internet connection. And, and not everyone clearly was able to move work, school, healthcare, entertainment, and so on online, as many of us were in more connected communities. And so there's a real demand here that's also driving some of this. The first area that I want to highlight briefly is one that I think it's both commercially important as well as strategically important. Subsea cables, as many of you know, carry the vast majority of international data. Rough estimate is about 95% of international data carried by subsea cables. And this is an interesting story here because this map that we're looking at, which illustrates subsea cables that Chinese companies have built or upgraded, this map did not exist a little over a decade ago. A little over a decade ago, China was largely dependent on foreign companies for this capability. And in order to obtain this capability, it formed a joint venture with a UK headquartered company. Huawei formed a joint venture with a company called Global Marine. And then the resulting joint venture, Huawei Marine, over the following decade, built about 100 projects. And it did so in, I think, a pretty strategic, methodical way in which it built progressively more complex and longer systems and acquired experience, know-how, and a track record to demonstrate to prospective customers that it could do these systems. And so that joint venture was purchased by Hengtong Group last year, and so it's now fully Chinese owned. And so Hengtong Group is the world's fourth major provider of these systems. So it's a relatively elite club of companies that are general contractors for these systems. There's 4 of them. One's in the United States, one is in Europe, one is in Japan, and now one is in China. It's interesting when you look at these projects, I think there's grounds to suggest that not all of them have solid economic fundamentals. For example, the cable that on this map that goes from Cameroon to Brazil carries relatively little traffic. But it was, for Huawei Marine, it was a big demonstration project. They were able to say that they built the first cable crossing the South Atlantic, first modern fiber optic cable crossing the South Atlantic. Unfortunately, Cameroon has debt that it took on from China Exim Bank for this project, which is now relatively underutilized. And there's some other projects just over the horizon that might come online that I think are interesting and worth tracking. One of them is called the Peace Cable, which connects Pakistan and Djibouti and several points in East Africa, and then goes up and lands in France. And so that's a massive project that is pretty close to completion. Second area that I want to highlight briefly here is one that I think hasn't received as much attention yet, but probably will get a little more attention in the coming years. And this is the provision of cloud infrastructure and cloud services. In this case, we're talking about e-government services. So this is a map that shows deals that Huawei has struck between foreign governments and state-owned enterprises. And I think what's striking here is that all of these deals, or most of them, were happening at a time when Huawei was encountering more scrutiny around 5G and in some cases, getting squeezed out of more advanced economies. And so to compensate for that, it's pivoting into providing services that are less dependent on advanced semiconductors, and it's selling in places where that security argument might not be as determinative. And so, literally, these are foreign governments that are, going with Huawei to store their data and for a whole range of services, everything from, electronic tax and health records to, in at least one case, electronic voting. So these are really, these are some sensitive data, sensitive functions. And I think it's a reminder here that, if the US wants to compete in these areas, it needs to be thinking about how it can offer more affordable alternatives. The other lesson to me that comes out of this map and this set of activities is that the US actually has currently many of the pieces of a very compelling offering. Just objectively, according to third-party studies, Huawei does not have the world's best cloud services. US companies have the world's best cloud services. So it's, they're effectively packaging an inferior product here and having foreign governments purchase it. And I think they're doing that effectively because they're packaging both the services, which again are not the world's best services, with infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, and they're offering a whole range of hard infrastructure, everything from data centers the size of a shipping container to multi-level facilities, and then they're bringing in state financing, and so that package becomes quite compelling. And so I think this is something that the U.S. needs to think about, because we have the elements of that package, but we might not be pulling them together in a compelling way and scaling them in a compelling way. The last area here that I want to highlight is one that I do expect will get more attention in the coming years. This is the competition to provide broadband from outer space, in this case through low Earth orbit satellite constellations. I think this is a fascinating development because we've got several US companies that are in the lead here. It's not a very big group, but in the lead developing these constellations. And you could imagine a situation in which these constellations help to provide broadband to rural and lower income markets. I think you probably need some kind of support financial support in order to make that viable, but it's definitely a possibility. China is developing its own alternative, not really quite as far ahead. Few details known about that alternative. But I think we can expect that China will develop its alternative in the same way that it progressively sought and acquired that capability to deliver subsea cables. I think this is an area where China will be making serious investments, and developing economies will be up for grabs here. Who's going to get landing rights in the world's emerging markets? I think that's still to be determined. And just underscoring here that there is really vast demand that remains unmet. I think sometimes when we talk about the 5G competition as a race, we forget that most of the world is still, or a lot of the world is still looking for 3G and 4G. And so by one estimate, only 15% of mobile users will have 5G by 2025. And so there's still this vast need for more connectivity, big opportunities here. If the U.S. can think think strategically about how to leverage and partner with the private sector, and these are big stakes too, involved not only commercially, but these are places where most of the world's population growth is going to occur in the coming years. And there are risks here of countries becoming overly dependent on a single supplier, or being locked into a supplier whose security might not be on the same standard as others. And so I think this is an area that in order to compete, the security argument though is not going to carry the day in a lot of these markets, and it really is about providing affordable alternatives. So let me leave it there, and also again just recommend that if you are interested in these digital infrastructure issues, we've got a whole bunch of resources on our website, reconnectingasia.csis.org. Thanks.
All right, well, fantastic. A great way to close this out there. So I know Naomi is short on time. If I could, she's actually typing back an answer. That's good for that. But real quick, what I wanted to do, if Naomi's got 30 more seconds, just to get some initial thoughts on Professor Shun's idea of governance and the future of the internet. And then Jonathan, certainly if you want to chime in on that. That was one of the key points I thought that was highlights the differences in approaches, and it's not good, it's not bad, it's just different. So
Sure. Yeah, I have a couple more minutes. Apologies, I'm en route to a doctor's appointment. But with respect to Professor Shun's remarks, I agree completely with what he was saying about the norms, the need to agree upon norms in the international community, and that China should be a part of those discussions. I think he also accurately represented what the distinction is between traditional espionage, which is considered, quote unquote, inbounds for all countries, versus economic theft. And it's still a mushy situation. It's difficult sometimes to determine what is or isn't inbounds, and especially what the intent is when you have dual use products and technology at play. But I think, generally he's on point that, that is the kind of unwritten agreement among governments. And so if the US government doesn't like the efforts that the Chinese government is making in traditional espionage, then the government has to be prepared to broker a different set of rules internationally. And I think, to Jonathan's points, there are a lot of, really interesting data points there with respect to the infrastructure that Huawei and others are lining up internationally. My takeaways from some of that are that, the US government arguments against Huawei in particular on the security side were simply not compelling. And, without giving sufficient evidence and, a rationale for completely blocking a company, I think that was to be expected. So we shouldn't be, surprised that other countries are adopting this technology at a good rate. I do agree that, governments overly relying on one set of technology, and in particular one supplier, is an issue. And that's something that, the COVID situation has brought to light, which I think is a good thing for both companies and governments to keep in mind, is that you need a diversity of suppliers for a healthy supply chain. But at the same time, the US government needs to be mindful of the cost imperatives that other governments are facing. And especially if the infrastructure is not used for sensitive government purposes, then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the real risk? And I think that's the question that governments are facing. Is it a risk that, the content streaming that everyday citizens are watching might be running over Chinese infrastructure? I think, probably we can say the answer is no. So we need to be careful with these blanket statements of what the security imperatives are and are not, as the US government in particular looks to influence other countries' decisions there.
Terrific, thanks. Jonathan?
Thanks. So just on, in terms of the competition aspect of this, I think because it's received a lot of attention, I think 5G is often on our minds when we're talking about digital infrastructure. And in a way, I understand it's a very important area, but in some of the areas that I was trying to highlight, from subsea cables to cloud services to some of these emerging satellite offerings, those are areas in which the US has already off-the-shelf alternatives to offer. And so I think it's a different, US has several advantages to put into play there. But I do agree that we, when making the sales pitch, I think it's important to do education on security risks and provide technical assistance so that countries can make, be their own best advocates and be aware of what some of the costs down the road might be if they don't apply that scrutiny up front. But ultimately, I do think that cost, affordability are really drivers for decision makers in these developing economies. And so to compete, we do need to be selling those economic benefits. And in some cases, I think U.S. companies are doing some of that, and just it's not being organized under a big U.S. government banner, and that's fine. When Google announces $1 billion that it's going to put into Africa over 5 years, it's not part of a grand U.S. plan to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. As Google being an internationally oriented company that sees opportunities in Africa. So I'm encouraged that some of the competition is happening. It's just in certain cases, I do think the U.S. government could be a little bit more forward-leaning, because large companies, large cloud providers, I think aren't often as interested in doing the smaller projects that China will do that will lead to bigger projects later on.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And again, just a different approach and different systems. So but it's important to remember that this whole thing is multifaceted, and there's not any clear black and white answers, as you pointed out. So Professor Shan, you did a great job of kind of talking about China's view of governance and the future. And I know we've talked a lot today about U.S. and China and the back and forth. I wonder if you could just kind of outline, what is China doing with the rest of the world? Jonathan's laid out as part of the BRI, but specifically for cyber governance, how is China engaging with Europe, the EU, or with ASEAN or other nations in developing some of these standards and norms?
Yeah, as I know, first, the Chinese government learns a lot from the GDPR to regulate how to protect privacy information and to build its new laws to protect privacy information. The first, which means the learning experience from the Europe side. And the second, from China's side, providing the developing countries this digital, the digital infrastructures is quite necessary, because those developing countries, before China entered their market, they did not have the opportunities, or either they cannot afford the cost to have their own digital infrastructures, which is very important for the economic development. And to China's side, we also try to accept or learning from the critics from all sides, especially from the United States, to accept this positive aspect from these critics to improve China's capacities and their patterns of doing business. Because what they did, at least from China's side, is nothing more than doing normal business with these developing countries, especially in our BRI initiations. And to the Huawei issues, I'd like to raise one point. It's very important to understand, to notice that in quite a long time, Huawei tried a lot to clear its relationship with Chinese government, not toward the US government, but toward Chinese peoples. In quite a long time, inside China, Huawei tried very, very best to clarify it's a kind of international companies rather than a Chinese companies. It's an independent international companies obey the very strict international business standard and the rules rather than a single Chinese companies. But it's not, and it's quite clear that the US government, they just don't believe, because Huawei it's a Chinese company. But in China, we have another explanation of these ways. It's called securitization. It's another name of trade protectionisms, in which it means that you cannot compete with Huawei in a fair ways. You try to take advantage of these security issues as kind of excuse. And sometimes this information provided by the news represented by Bloomberg. Bloomberg set up a report said to finding the bugs inside Huawei.
Cyber connection strikes again. Let's see if he pops back on real quick. If not, I kind of following on that same thread, Jonathan, what I was trying to drive at there is, as China goes and builds the infrastructure in these places that you've outlined, does that make them more likely, less likely, or really have no influence on supporting China and their views of global governance? At the the ITU, at the UN, and all these other kind of places that are really wonky in the background, but set all the standards and have a huge effect that very few of us actually appreciate.
Yeah, I do see these projects as an avenue for having influence in some of those fora, and you see instances of at least the rhetoric about cyber sovereignty being emulated in some developing countries, and some concerning trends toward data localization. I mean, cyber sovereignty can mean very different things, but it's attractive to lots of different groups. And so, I mean, in some cases, a country will say, that a data center that's being provided by, a foreign company with foreign financing operated by foreign workers is contributing to its cyber sovereignty, which is a little bit rich. But then some of the technical assistance that comes with these projects, you're training foreign officials in some cases, and I think all of that can reinforce or make it more likely for views to overlap with the party that's providing the training.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that's kind of one of the issues there is, I guess there's clearly no right or wrong in this as to how you approach governance. And again, although we've been dealing with cyber issues now for a little while here, they are still fairly new and they continue to develop. So, the issues of cyber sovereignty and what does that actually mean? And I think it's interesting to talk about now the cables and things that connect it, because I know certainly in the world of finance, this is one of the levers that the United States uses from time to time, is the fact that, all of the cables, and even if there's an exchange of money that has nothing to do with the United States itself, between other companies or countries, for oil example, a lot of that still flows through the SWIFT system, through US banking, and that allows us to have, a particular lever if we want to execute sanctions or, the threat of sanctions. And so as we continue to develop the digital age, and as the digital economy grows, some of those questions that you highlight there in the book, I think are really going to be central as to how we go forward. We the United States, we the department, as well as we the world, and how we solve some of these issues. So, Professor Sean, I see you're back on. If you wanted to make a comment there.
Yeah, I think it's done. That's done.
So, we did have a question in the chat, a couple questions actually, but one of which Ms. Wilson was able to answer before she had to jump off. But I just want to let everyone know we're talking about the intrusions that are going on, and is necessarily a drop in what we see. Does that indicate there's an overall drop, or perhaps are there reasons behind it? And she says, hey, people on all sides continue to spy on each other, and again, we have to we have different opinions on what is and is not inbound. Certainly, traditional spying that happens to be done through cyber means, we continue to see that inbounds. Some of the economics, right? The United States doesn't, but we have to remember we have partners and allies, some in Europe, some on the Mediterranean there that take a different view than we do. So it's not just China and the US view. Again, it's multifaceted and multinational. Professor Shun pointed out in the comments that, the US capacity to spy on China is just as equal as the capacity for China to spy on the United States. And that is one thing we need to keep in mind, especially here in Washington. If you read the papers and things like that, you certainly get a particular view of the world that not everyone around the world shares, right? And there's shades of gray and all that. And so anyhow, so Jonathan, I don't know if you saw that question in the chat or not, if you had any additional thoughts you wanted to add.
No, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay. And then there was another question about how do we engage with China? Is it best to do it bilaterally or multilaterally? Ms. Wilson put in there the fact that it really needs to be both. But given the current state of our bilateral relationship, perhaps multilateral is really the way to go. And I think at least the tentative steps under the Biden administration seem to indicate that there's a slight shift there, and that perhaps that's how we'll move forward. But I think, and this again goes back to the whole Belt and Road, right? I mean, China certainly wants to engage the rest of the world, not just simply through a China-U.S. lens, right? But through these multifaceted lens. They have a great partnership with African countries individually, as well as Africa as a whole, and same goes for ASEAN. So I think the U.S. would be well suited to think about those things, and as we adopt these policies and really just the ideas of governance as they continue to develop, it needs to be focused multilaterally. So again, Jonathan, points you want to jump in on that? Again, I'm just reading these things that she typed in before she had to jump off.
No, I think that's fine, but thanks.
Okay, so I continue to urge people use the Q&A function. If you're on YouTube or Facebook, put them in the comments section. We'll continue to get to it. And so the next real question was, I thought Naomi did a great job of kind of pointing out the so what of things, right? But the follow-on question to that is, so what's next? And so as we continue to go forward, we see 5G. We already talked about, what happens the next generation of that, the Internet of Things, laying cables. We didn't really even talk about space, right? So, cyber provision of cyber services and internet services through space is certainly going to be a huge change across the world. It will bring capabilities to people that don't have them now, and it will be provided by China, by the United States, presumably by Russia, or at least a Russian company, and as well as Europe. So, Jonathan, I'd like to get as you look into your crystal ball there and see the future of these things developing. What are the main things that we should be thinking about as we look to the future?
Yeah, so if we think about the first phase of the tech competition, at least the recent tech competition between the United States and China being focused on 5G, and I think it was mainly a story of advanced economies applying more scrutiny ultimately, but the rest of the world still in play. I think the next phase will be potentially broader range of related technologies. So I think cloud computing will become the competition there will intensify a little bit. There are several Chinese cloud providers who are relatively small outside of China. I mean, they enjoy great protections within China, but they're relatively small outside China, but very interested in expanding into Southeast Asia, Latin America, other markets. So I think that's going to intensify a little bit. The arrival of these low Earth orbit broadband services, I think, is also a really interesting development, one that could open new avenues for the U.S. and its partners and allies to provide global connectivity if they're able to marshal resources to maybe even through the World Bank to help support some of that. And an issue that I didn't mention related to that, but probably of interest to this audience, is just that I think as that competition continues, when we're talking about constellations of thousands of satellites being put into orbit. And so there's also going to be a need for coordination, even between among competitors, to ensure that we're avoiding accidents, that safety measures are in place, because you've just got a kind of recipe there for unintended consequences if we're not careful.
Yeah, that's terrific, and that highlights another one of the key areas that CASI likes to look at is space situational awareness, space traffic management. And obviously that's one of our bread and butter issues here at the Aerospace Studies Institute. So that's great that you highlight that. Professor Shun, what, as you look forward, the Chinese system has some great unique capabilities and has some developing commercial, both in the satellite realm and in the just the cyber provision realm. What does China see as the future development?
The future development of internet is very important, and China's government will continue to improve its capacities to regulate the behaviors in the cyberspace so that the development of digital economies can boost the development of national economies. And the Chinese government can, with the help of internet, to launch more effective governance capacities to providing better lives to normal Chinese peoples. And also Chinese government want to contribute more to global cyberspace governance issues, which will helping to building the norms in the framework of OEWG in the UN framework and so on, I think, in more very brief and general ways.
Yeah, and I like to remind people, China has far more internet users than the United States even has people. And so, this is an important it's an important issue for all Chinese people, right? Not just government to government, but certainly companies and the people at the grassroots. And I remember there were villages that we visited when we were living in China that just recently had gotten full-time power, and they'd skipped an entire generation. Nobody had landlines, everybody had cell phones, and now you can have cell phones.
To that point, the real challenge is not from the Chinese government, is from frankly speaking, the US government. What's US government treatment for those Chinese companies doing business? For example, the TikTok, the WeChat, it's launched very important effect to these companies' understanding to Sino-US relations, and it will improve a lot to Chinese peoples to understand how to estimate US policy on cyber issues and so on. When Trump government launched very critical policies, either toward Huawei or toward TikTok, it sometimes breaking up the perceptions for normal Chinese peoples, and especially do damage to the supervisors of these Chinese companies. For example, the founding father of TikTok, the Zhang Yiming, is famous for its favorite for US model of governance in company issues, and producing another big, duplicate the success mode of US companies is their dreams. But frankly speaking, the experience of doing business in the United States is not that good for these kind of peoples. And in futures, if Sino-US relationships can go back to normal ways, and if Washington can restore its traditional, more rational policy on dealing with all these things, maybe it will have more positive effect on those normal people's, normal companies in the digital field and cyberspace issues, I think.
No, that's great. We got a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask you one final question, then we'll give you each a minute or two to sum up or give any last remarks. But I guess the question right now is that, when the United States looks at China, when China looks at the United States, we tend to see them both as 10 feet tall, and outpacing each other, right? And I think that's probably true from both perspectives, but we also have both have some serious things to work on. And so what I wanted to do was just get your impression of Professor Shun. What does China need to work on? Where is China behind, right? What are some of the weaknesses we have there? And then Jonathan, same question to you, except for from the U.S. perspective. Do a self-survey of what do we need to do better. So, Professor Shun.
From China's side, Chinese government need to improve its cyber policy, regulation system, cyber-related regulation systems in more general ways, which means that we're living friendly. Since our economic development, China become the number 2 of the countries in the world. Chinese government need to become more open up in the cyberspace, need to launch a more transparency systems and launch more effective policies to balance the protecting of privacy information, boost the digital economies, and keep or protect the national securities. It will challenge to the general capacities, in which way the Chinese government can be more tolerant to those informations spread in the cyberspace in more general ways, and whether the Chinese government can become more open, especially open the domestic market for those huge tech companies all around, especially from the United States, of course, in certain ways. You know what I mean. I mean, we need to improve our systems, represent those regulation systems. And second is for those people who's working inside Chinese government, it need to have a new perceptions. Then it will, how to say, become more tolerant toward conflict or those very sharp critic point informations from outside, especially from the United States. And then both China and the United States need to become more confident and learning how to respect their difference and take a more frank attitude to dealing with this difference in more frank ways, I think.
No, that's great. Jonathan, thoughts?
So I think the U.S. With partners and allies need to expand the availability of. I mean, this is sort of in my space of things I cover. We need to expand the availability of affordable infrastructure, and digital infrastructure is an important part of that. There's a lot of really promising efforts that have been announced just over the past year, and a couple that go back a little bit longer, several years, where the U.S. is working with partners and allies. So, the Build Back Better World partnership that was announced through the G7 has digital infrastructure as one of its 4 pillars. I think we're going to hear more about that next year with some announcements and some projects. The U.S. is also working with the EU through the Trade and Technology Council. There's a working group that works on ICT issues. The Quad has an infrastructure coordination group, and it's also working. It's been working on technology principles. It's got a technology working group too. So we have these, I think, really promising efforts for allied cooperation that I think are helping to bridge areas where we diverge and help hopefully marshal more resources, collective resources, to expand the availability of affordable projects. And so there's a lot of work though that needs to happen to really get the most out of those. It's really difficult to coordinate among different countries, all these different economic agencies. I think there's probably lessons that could be learned from some of the joint military operations in the history, that is sort of the experience of improving coordination among allied militaries that could be applied to help improve coordination among economic agencies. So I'm really encouraged by all those developments. I just think there's a lot we need to do to operationalize them.
Well, and obviously you're speaking to the right group here, talking about taking military lessons learned and applying them to other aspects of the U.S. Government as well as our commercial sector. So any other thoughts, things you want to hit on? Tell people where to buy your book, etc.
Yeah, your local bookstore or Amazon or Barnes and Noble, any of those places. There's the hard copy, there's the audio version, and the Kindle version. So whatever works for you. And I welcome comments too. If you pick up a copy, let me know what you think. That's really one of the fun parts of writing, is to hear from people who engage with the material. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Professor Shun, I know it's late for you. Any last comments or thoughts that you'd like to pass along?
I think no, but in short is I wish in future Sino-US relationship should come back to the normal ways as soon as possible. That will do benefit for both of us.
I agree wholeheartedly, and hopefully at some point in the future we won't be dealing with the bilateral issues and COVID issues and things like that, and we can get back to doing some of these things in person. So until next time, I appreciate those joining us early, those joining us very late, and everyone else that's watching. I think this has been another great webinar. We will continue this. We will see you next year in the first quarter as we move on. And to Jonathan and Professor Shun, I look forward to continuing the dialogue for now and in the future. So thank you very much for joining us. And everyone else, have a great day. And this is us at CASI signing off for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.